With the years and through the strong leadership of our Watershed Council, there are guided me to really taking a more holistic approach. And that is not only taking the physical science, but also being rooted within the traditional and traditional knowledge. So with that, it's like learning to really from the Western background, going into more the traditional, which kind of I always say is like getting their understanding when we talk about spiritual, traditional, and values. They are associated with water. And so that's just kind of giving you a little bit and background about myself, about the diversity within our organizations, to taking on a German and to leading their science program, but also their inclusion of sharing their knowledge and also, I would say, guiding me to really get a deeper understanding about the holistic approach and what it means, and also through my education, Western education, in the combination of the traditional, I would call it education kind of knowledge system, really understanding a little bit better and maybe hoping to share what I mean about changes I see what should happen when we refer to water management, but also water governance. So the Indigenous Observation Network really started off in 2006 when leadership decided that they want to take action, and these actions are really translated in creating their own monitoring network. And that started because of the distrust of federal and state monitoring, that also that they felt like the data have not been shared adequately, or the data was not communicated, and that kind of translated through the academia that there was a perception that academia came in, done the research and just left. And there was the data sharing and data communication was not existing. They also feel that a lot of the monitoring programs, they had overarching themes and not really addressing local concerns. There have been concerns about that there were perceived local hires, less educated, could not really provide the same standards to folks that came within to the community to take their water samples that went through Western education. So through years and through training and empowerment, I call it, and also making the program relevant, it really allows us to be sustainable. And that is a big term, because sustainable, everyone knows the Yukon is a transboundary watershed. So having a monitoring network across both sides is very unique, and in terms of having a monitoring program that is now 17 years, it's even more unique in terms of Alaska. I know that's not probably compared it to programs here in the US, lower 48. So our program is really roots in environmental technicians within the communities that are being trained. They're also through empowering the youth, bringing the youth and bringing them in as we call it assistants in young age, so they're getting the exposure, but also having water ceremonies to really share the value and spirits, and so bringing that holistic approach. So what we struggle, and when we talk about water inclusion, is looking at Alaska, the scale and size. Like I said, it was transboundary and transboundary watershed, but also when you look at, and that is from the USGS, National Water Information System, existing data within the Yukon. And so at the moment, when we talk about USGS, we only have 3 gauging stations, and only one is collecting water quality data, and that's it. So you have all in comparison to the lower 48, all this massive black dots, and then you have the really, I would say, really spit dots right here in Alaska. So there's, I think, what have to change is the interest in Alaska again for a large-scale data collection in terms of, I would say, the understanding how a river system right now vulnerable to climate change, but also a river system that is still pristine. And communities that rely on these river systems for their livelihood, for the drinking water, but also a river system that is fragile right now, which is used as the major transport pathway. So looking at the, I would say, gap of data, looking at engaging and encouraging agencies to really engage with networks there's existing, to use existing connection with community members, exploring avenues how to really align different interests when it comes to research interest, but also inviting Indigenous people in the dialogue about what framework changes has to be done to have a sustainable water resource. And that is looking at the water management aspect and looking at the, I call it like the complexity, but also compartmentalized in terms of when we talk about water permitting with water quantity. We're talking about regulations that only refers to water quality. We have fish biologists, and we have certain agencies that are not even communicating with each other. But in terms of changes in the river, we have one ecosystem. I think having an idea of removing water management and actually having a holistic approach to call it aquatic ecosystem management. So looking also to incorporate Indigenous governance view to really bring down to water, not only seeing it as a resource, but also as a spirit, as a value, and to renaming water bodies to their traditional names is a starting point. I think that is bringing it back to a value, and to also be, I would say, encouraging and providing a deeper connection to these water bodies, and with that also a deeper protection. Inviting Indigenous people to explore areas of significant interest for protection, and so we can continue working on restoration project that is relevant not only to the community, but also for the general public and within the kind of Indigenous view. And I think that's it.
So I'm Owen McKenna. I'm a research ecologist with the USGS. I am located in Jamestown, North Dakota, at a wildlife research center, the Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center, and then I'm also work with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is co-located at the University of Minnesota in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I mostly study wetlands as a research scientist. And I've grew up near Chicago and studied Great Lakes coastal wetlands as an undergrad, and went down to the desert Southwest to study playas in the Chihuahuan Desert in New Mexico, and then moved up to North Dakota to study prairie pothole wetlands, which are wetlands that are very abundant and used to be even more abundant, and kind of contained in an area down from Iowa to Montana. And so part of that area is looking at kind of issues of how these wetlands are managed and what different services these wetlands provide for the different communities in areas like southwest Minnesota and the Minnesota River Basin, which happens to also be where 4 different Dakota tribes are located as well. So I'm leading a project kind of working in the Minnesota River Basin with many different stakeholders and rights holders, and coming from working for a federal agency, I'm really learning a lot, navigating kind of best practices, worst practices, and in engaging with our tribal partners, and having their voices heard especially the 4 tribes that I work with are very uniquely situated along the Minnesota River, and then as well as the Mississippi River. And so they don't have very big land bases that they manage, but they are and they're downstream of a lot of different agricultural and other influences that impact their water quality of their own cultural resources and water resources. And so in having a project that's really working on this diverse landscape of a basin, but then also bringing together these different voices, I think is really helping me understand and navigate sort of the local realities of some of these water quality issues, and then also some of the barriers and issues that the tribes are facing in the Midwest in terms of capacity, in terms of staffing their own monitoring programs, and the ways in which there are lots of disparities. But it's been really a good learning process for me to understand kind of the best ways to engage and find collaborations, but also to consider different cultural resources and working with groups that are working more in northern Minnesota on wild rice production and those rethinking kind of the ways that Western scientists can be collaborating and learning from our Indigenous partners.
Thank you. So, Mara Diaz, I work with the Surfrider Foundation. I lead our clean water work. I live up on the eastern end of Long Island in New York on Nantucket lands. I use pronouns she, her. And I'm going to be talking about some of the barriers that I've perceived that Surfrider Foundation collectively, because we have volunteer-led chapters in coastal states around the country. This program, our Blue Water Task Force, is about 30 years and running now, so there's been a lot of lessons learned through our successes and some of our challenges or failures in trying to lead inclusive, diverse water quality monitoring programs. We focus specifically in the coastal zone. We run beach water quality monitoring programs. We're testing recreational waters in the coastal area for fecal indicator bacteria to answer the questions, is this safe to swim, play, recreate, surf in or not? So that's sort of the context for where I'm going to be coming from. The number one barrier that we see is really based on where our agencies monitoring the water, testing the water. What do they consider recreational water to begin with? And most beach monitoring programs run by states and county health departments are limited for resources. So they have to prioritize, how can I stretch my monitoring dollars to protect the most people possible? And that typically means they focus their monitoring on ocean, lifeguarded beaches that are favored by oftentimes tourists. Virginia Beach, right? You know, there's a lot of people down there on those beaches, and that means they skip and are not able to cover a lot of the more rural or community-based beaches or recreation that might be happening in bays or estuaries, coastal ponds up where I live, more calmer waters. And it's these waters that often have more pollution concerns, right? They get more of that direct stormwater runoff or cesspools, septic, sewer leaks. The water stays in there long. So you have this dichotomy of the tourists versus rural communities, lifeguarded, typical beach going versus surfing or traditional Hawaiian fishing practices or, you know, canoe launches, those types of things. And then there's a real long-seated, deep-seated just racism in general along the coast, right? Where BIPOC communities have been made to feel either that they weren't allowed on our sandy beaches or they were made to feel uncomfortable so that they didn't come. And while this might not be as pervasive today as it was in the 60s or the 50s or the 70s, there's still some of that that carries over. And on top of the racism, there's people are getting economic issues, right? The real estate market people can't afford to live by the beach, or if they want to drive to the beach, they might have to pay $30, $40, $50 a day to park. Public transportation's not great. One example we see of this in Surfrider is LA, where our chapter there deals with kids a lot that live 1 to 2 miles from the beach and in BIPOC communities, and they don't even see the ocean, let alone really enjoy playing in it. So that's one of the goals of that chapter, is they're working to bring some of these communities just out to the beach to enjoy, right? So they can appreciate that. Funding, right? Lower economic communities don't have the same resources to put into environmental management activities like water quality monitoring that more affluent neighborhoods do. We really see this in our school systems, in our public schools versus maybe a private school. And then time. If you, a lot of people in lower economic neighborhoods don't have the extra time because they're worried about working and what's happening with the kids and food on the table and paying rent, mortgage. So to have like 2 hours every week, let alone every month, to volunteer their time to go collect a water sample or go in the lab, that's considered a luxury, you know, and I think a lot of us don't think of it as that. And then the other thing that we struggle with to really collect samples and get them processed out in more rural communities, because we do test for bacteria, which has a 6-hour holding time, is access to labs. If the communities you want to test in, the waterways are far from the lab, it's hard to get them there sometimes within that holding time. On the opposite side, in the real urban areas like downtown New York City or Miami, where just getting around is painful, you know, people don't want to deal with that traffic or the transportation to bring a sample to the lab. So on the bright side, what are some of the actions that we're taking? What we're learning is helping to address some of these barriers is, first, how we set up our sampling plans. Where are we testing? We really aim with Surfrider's program to fill in the gaps of the agency health programs to cover more diverse communities as well as diverse recreation types. You know, we're, again, out there where people are putting their boats into the water or their paddle boards or the canoes, where people like to just like hang out at the creeks that feed into the intercoastal waterway. You know, this is where a lot of the pollution's coming from, and where communities tend to think, oh, I'm gonna let the kids go in the water here, right? It's safe, there's no waves, but oftentimes there's pollution in those waters. Another thing that's been really successful for us is we really talk up our programs, our volunteer-led chapters. Every time we go out and we sample, our chapters will send out email water quality reports. They post on lots of different forms of social media that often get picked up by the regular media, like, hey, Surfrider's out there, we're testing, so you know where it's safe to get in the water. Come back tomorrow. Hey, look what we found. So by doing all of this outreach, we find, in sort of a passive way, we're recruiting more diverse communities into our program, because they're saying, hey, how can I get involved? Who's testing my beach? Will you test my beach? And that's where then we have to show up, right? We have to show up at the community where people are. You know, one good example I have of this is out on the eastern end of Maui, somebody from Hana, which is a real long road, said, hey, will you please test our beaches? The state is not testing it. And we're like, okay, hold on, let's figure it out, right? And we did. We were actually able to collect samples, and they were put it on the FedEx truck that does the daily route to get it to the lab. It worked sometimes. It didn't always work. But that was more data than they had before. But the coordinator there was also going out and showing up at their festivals. They had a Limu festival. This is their traditional harvesting of algae, the seaweed that they enjoy, that they have a high culture value for. So they'd show up at these like community things, and when they did, the kids were like, we love this. What are you doing? What's this pipette? What are these glowing wells? And he was able to make connections with a teacher there, and then he set up a program in the school. And that's another thing that we're seeing is, you know, really looking to the schools and the youth as a way to get into communities more, looking for local partners to partner with so that we're not going in and starting a new project, but supporting the people who are already there, trying to preserve culture and the environment. And then being flexible, like that story from Hana. There might be ways you had initially set up your program, like this is how it's going to work, and then you get this call from this community that has no water quality information at all, 4 hours drive there and back. How can we accommodate this? And just doing the best that you can while still meeting your standard operating. Oh, look at that, I clicked it all the way. So this is a remote island out, a remote village on the western side of Oahu, where we're testing now. I'm not sure how to do this. They have, it's a really loved beach, but they have some definitely water quality issues out there. We're testing with them now, they're testing, and we're processing in the lab. This was at school out in Hana. The kids really, really, really loved it, and it's cool because you're empowering them to be involved. And we've seen a lot of our volunteers for our program as kids to go on and pursue careers in environmental science. Anyway, this is a traditional fishing pond out on Maui. This is a really cool freshwater site where I don't know if you can really see it, but they climb up the cliff and jump down into the water. I did not do that, but they love it. And you know, again, with the fresh water, it does get polluted from time to time. And then South Bay, this is what I mentioned in LA. They've really done a great job, that chapter, and really reaching kids. They host kids from I think 8 local schools now to go out and collect samples. They learn how to process it, and they really coach them on, hey, if you wanted to have a career in environmental science or water quality science one day, what would that look like? What steps do you have to take as sort of part of the curriculum to participating in the program? I think that was it for me. That's Mary, our coordinator there. I just had to give her a little prop. She does a great job with it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mara. Our next panelist is Natalie.
Hey everyone. I don't have any cool pictures, so I'm going to use Mara's and just leave that one up there. And I wanted to thank Nick and Sylvia and everyone on the panel for inviting me to be on the panel, but also for just being a great group of people to work with. Took one brainstorming session to throw our piece together, that I'm sure took Nick and Sylvia a lot more months. And it's just an inspiring group of people to work with. I'm Natalie Coleman. I'm coming from Washington State. I was born and raised mostly in California, but have since lived in 9 different states in our country. And I love each piece of it, all its people, all their differences. And that's what I'm here to talk about. So in Washington State, we have 29 federally recognized tribes. A statement which in and of itself, I think, doesn't quite do the tribes justice, because it shouldn't necessarily be up to the federal government to give you your own identity and to be recognized. Federal recognition doesn't mean that you're not a tribe. So I just wanted to make that clear. But we have a lot of tribes in Washington State, and I work for the Washington State Department of Ecology for their marine monitoring unit as an ocean acidification scientist. So even though I'm based in Olympia, just south of Seattle, I get to sample throughout the whole Salish Sea, all of Puget Sound, the Georgia Strait, and our coastal bays, Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor as well, all of which are touched at some point by these 29 different tribes. So I'm going to reiterate probably a lot of what the other panelist members have said, maybe not as well, but I wanted to focus on 3 key aspects that I've seen from my personal experience, which is the value of early education in these natural resource fields, the really hard pressure that we put on a Western education and making really early decisions, particularly in college for STEM fields, and then how to work within the bounds of state government when working with tribes, and maybe some success stories there. So I was also privileged before my career as a scientist with the state to be an instructor in the Upward Bound program, and then also a community college and regional college instructor in marine biology, marine science, and oceanography. So Washington State is an interesting place. Probably like many other states, we have a lot of urban centers that have more property taxes, higher property values, and more diversity in the classes that they offer for their K through 12 schools. It's also better funded. And these areas are surrounded by much larger stretches of land that are inhabited by people of different socioeconomic statuses that are not as fortunate to have these programs and these classes in their K through 12 schools. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the Upward Bound program. It is a federally funded program through the TRIO grant. And so when I was living in Whatcom County, it's the most northwest county in Washington State, bordering Canada, we had Bellingham, which was a kind of suburban center, population 100,000. And if you drive 15 minutes outside Bellingham, there are schools where 16-year-olds have not heard the theory of evolution yet. And that really stuck with me. That was really impactful for me. So what the Upward Bound program did is based out of Whatcom Community College, which is on the outskirts of Bellingham City proper. They offered a summer program that lasted 8 to 10 weeks that bused, of no cost, children that were from age 11 to 18 from middle schools and high schools in the surrounding rural communities and bused them to the community college building. When we took them on field trips, we had instructors in math, science, both chemistry and biology, language arts, and social sciences. And I saw the value of this in the kids that we were able to teach. That's where I met Mason from Nooksack Valley High School, who was just so enthused with everything we were teaching him, everything he hadn't been exposed to, just by going out to Lake Whatcom with a pipette and showing him everything that was in the water. So I think the value of instilling an appreciation of nature and also being able to be out at a young age before you're hectically trying to keep a job and also try to do college is really important. I've seen the value of that. And I think it echoes to what our plenary speaker this morning said. He got published at 15. He got published at 15 in the Audubon Society. And that's something that a lot of, I think, these kids have not heard of. So supporting Upward Bound programs where we can, supporting that education of rural communities, I think is really important. And speaking of college, as a first-generation college student, like a lot of people, we didn't have good finances. I didn't necessarily have an example of what is this supposed to look like. And a lot of the scholarships out there said, you know, STEM scholarships. Oh, this is great, I'm going into a STEM field. And from my experience, quite a bit of those, the majority of those are people who want to go into technology. So when I thought STEM, I thought whales, sharks, hell yeah, ocean. And instead it was, do you want to work for Google? And that was the vast majority of the funding that was available during that time window, at least. So I think we can also encourage, how do we encourage people who are underrepresented, underserved from these different communities? How can we encourage funding of those without being so specific? So why are we asking people that are, 16, 17, 18 years old to make life decisions in exactly what their major should be just so they can get funds to go to college? So that was the second thing I wanted to talk about, was how do we make that funding more flexible while still supporting underserved communities without making them have to have pressure to make these huge decisions of what they're going to do with the rest of their life when they're 17 years old, if they even have the privilege of going to college. And then lastly, I wanted to focus on the work we're doing at Washington State. Like I said, we have a lot of tribes, and within the Puget Sound, we have a working group similar to the network that Edda was describing, but maybe not as far along. But we have a Marine Waters working group, and there are many other different subject working groups within the Puget Sound. And we meet every other month, and by we, I mean state departments, city departments, tribes. A lot of tribes show up, and then also nonprofits. We've even had Surfrider at one point. And we all talk about what the water quality is doing in our marine system. What was it doing for the last 2 months? So we get to see perspectives from not just our box. We get federal, state, city, county, tribes, and volunteers and nonprofits. So anywhere that that can be encouraged within other states, I think is really valuable. And I think is also something that's happening kind of right now, that our plenary speaker spoke about, with making these different coalitions, making these different networks so that people can really talk to each other and see who's doing what well, who has knowledge that we don't have. And that's where I wanted to end with that. Tribal ecological knowledge or indigenous traditional knowledge is really something that I think is extremely valuable, that can be incorporated, hopefully, into state governments. And so what the Department of Ecology has done is we now have a tribal liaison that reports and connects directly with the director of the Department of Ecology and the deputy director, and interfaces with tribes. We try to include not just tribes, but everyone else besides the state when we do our working groups. And I think that's really important because they have no PhDs maybe, but they have knowledge that you can't get just from going to a traditional Western education. So we've done some stuff well, and I think we could do better, but there are some success stories, and I think there's always room for more people at the table.
Good afternoon. It's great being on a great panel with a bunch of super people, and great being here, and thank you for your time. So I was in a meeting, and so someone presented this fences concept that exists. And so you have equality, you have equity, and you have justice. But to me, I think one of the fences was missing. It's the fence, and it's why we're here. It's because the fence that people of color, for some reason, hold up and present to themselves and allow it to be a barrier in terms of becoming involved with stream monitoring and getting outside and environmental issues. So at the Prince William County Water and Soil Conservation Group, we're doing a bunch of efforts to, they've been encouraging, they've brought me on as an assistant director, and they've encouraged the outreach to through our school system, which is in the process of incorporating environmental science core elements. They're outreaching to the disadvantaged schools, providing them tools and information, little sample monitoring kits, and encouraging the stream monitoring process. But also, the outreach has to be at the local levels and the social and civic groups. So when you approach some civic groups, whether it's of your culture or another culture, they may or may not be receptive to your outreach. But the thing is, there is a way ahead. As I mentioned before, we're using the core competency of the school system to allow us to outreach and to promote the stream monitoring certification. Also, one of the things that I'm going to be doing in June is being a little creative and doing a Juneteenth stream monitoring with, as an outreach tool to get other, organizations involved with, the stream monitoring concept, as well as incorporating it into the cultural event of Juneteenth. And, I'm also the environmental justice vice president for my branch in Prince William County. And you don't feel that just because you're not of the same hue. The NAACP was founded by a lot of, almost pretty much, I think, a majority of white people. So in the beginning. So don't feel that you can't outreach to us, you can't outreach to CASA or any other organization. but because they may be receptive and it may be what they need to jumpstart or get their children involved in these processes. I really applaud the the outreach of to the indigenous population as well as the Hawaiian natives, but we seem to have a concept that people of color, that this is not our land, but it is our land. It's everybody's land. It's like all Guthrie said, this land is your land, this land is my land. And you are just as welcome to it to come out and monitor and to monitor the environment. So moving ahead, it seems like the way ahead is to be more creative, try to incorporate cultural events into the stream monitoring and to uplift the culture that way, to I guess maximize the participation into stream monitoring as a result of and tied to the environment, which most, well, if not all, indigenous people of color have some form of tie to it.